You are listening to episode 300 of Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is October 20th, 2024, and this is episode 300 of Lighthearted. I put together what I think is a very special episode for this occasion. In the past couple of weeks, I've spoken individually with almost everyone who's served as a co-host of this podcast over the past 5+ years. I asked each person a simple question: what has been your most memorable lighthouse experience? I had trouble deciding the order of the segments, so I wrote all the names on scraps of paper and put them into a baseball cap. The first I drew is Sarah MacHugh. Sarah lives near Boston and works as the Associate Director of Events and Visits at UMass Boston. She has co-hosted a few times, and we've worked together on a couple of videos. So here's Sarah. I think you know the drill, what we're doing today. There's just one question, and that question is, what has been your most memorable lighthouse experience?
Sure. And this is a pretty hard question because there's been so many memorable experiences. But I'm going to talk about Apse Lighthouse. And I've chosen my experience at Apse Lighthouse because I think it goes against some of the things that I love so much about other lighthouses, but in a really cool way. So I think many of us have similar experiences when you go and seek out looking at lighthouses, finding them. You find typically a nice little seaside town that you're at and beautiful views and somewhat more quaint or off the beaten path or something like that. And when I went down for the New Jersey Lighthouse Challenge 2 years ago, it brought me to Atlantic City and Apse Lighthouse. And while Apse Lighthouse does hold many of those same elements of other lighthouses, it's also somewhat in the center of Atlantic City, which I never knew about, and it was absolutely changed my perspective on lighthouses when I saw it. And you could also see a really cool juxtaposition of old and new and of the technology of a lighthouse with essentially a city growing around it. Yeah. So I went there. I had my dog, Coda the Keeper, with me. We went and saw all the lighthouses of New Jersey, which if you haven't, I totally recommend that. But once we got to Apse Lighthouse, first of all, the little museum and lighthouse keeper house that's attached to the lighthouse is dog friendly, and you can bring your dog in. You're also greeted by a keeper himself in the full keeper uniform, which is very cool. He holds the door for you, welcomes you in. So I got to bring my dog inside, which, if you know me, was a very cool experience. Yep. And then climb the lighthouse, which is the tallest lighthouse in New Jersey. I can't remember how many steps, but I know the Barnegat Lighthouse is 217 and Apse is higher than that.
Yeah, I'm thinking 223 for some reason, but don't quote me on that.
Something like that. It beats the 217. I know that. So as you climb the lighthouse, in each different window that you can look out, there's a little booklet that shows you what that view would have looked like throughout the years. So over, I think it's probably a century or like 150 years, how that developed. So what started out as just a resort town, a beach town, turned into Atlantic City and grew over the years. So as you flip through these books, you can see all the streets around you kind of growing and building all around the lighthouse. And when you get to the top, although it's the tallest lighthouse in New Jersey, you're still surrounded by skyscrapers. And they had mentioned that the invention of the elevator was really what allowed any building to get taller than the lighthouse. And once the elevator was invented, then the lighthouse kind of became obsolete in certain ways. So it was really fascinating to see that the parallel of those two different things, this older technology next to skyscrapers and a city, but also a very cool view. And that was really striking to me because you think about the lighthouse standing alone on its own out on a peninsula or closer to the shoreline, somewhere where it's very protected, and it kind of speaks for itself. But this lighthouse is found within that area. And that was really, really interesting. It felt a little sad to me, but it also felt really cool and just different than any lighthouse I had climbed. And I will never forget that.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it is an unusual setting. It really is. It's a little jarring in a way.
Yeah.
In such an urban setting, but it's a beautiful lighthouse, and Nice, like you said, in the keeper's house, the museum and shop and everything in there.
Yeah, yeah.
People are so nice. In my experience, I was just there for the first time this past May, and I haven't done the challenge, but I went to a whole bunch of New Jersey lighthouses of
Hmm.
my own this past May, and the people there were so nice. And I've had people from there on the podcast a couple of times. I'm wondering if the volunteer who greeted you when you were there was the legendary Buddy Grover. Do
I
you know?
think it was. I want to say it was.
Yeah. Do you know about him? He just passed away early this year at 96.
No, I didn't know that, but wow.
Yeah, and he had been a volunteer there for about 10 years. And for most of those years, he was climbing the lighthouse, I think at least a couple of times a week and greeting people at the top. But it might have been him at the bottom that day when you were there.
Yeah,
Yeah. Was he an older gentleman with glasses?
definitely an older gentleman,
Yeah.
and he had the whole uniform on. But yeah, I think it was probably the same person.
That was probably Buddy, and he was.
Yeah,
I what didn't have the pleasure of meeting him in person, but I had him on the podcast last year, and what an amazing guy he was.
very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Coda didn't. Your dog didn't climb the stairs of the lighthouse,
No,
right?
the dog can't climb the stairs. That would have been a lot.
Yeah,
But he
yeah.
got to check out the gift shop and the little museum and stuff.
hmm By the way, it's 228 stairs as we were
228.
speaking.
Okay.
I looked it up, so I was close when I
You're
said
pretty close.
223,
Yeah.
228. Yeah. Well, thank you, Sarah. That's great. I'm finding it really interesting that with everybody I'm asking this question, the answers are all over the map,
Hmm.
which is great. And that's what lighthouses are many things to many people, many different kinds of experiences and so forth. So it's really nice hearing your own experience there. So thank you for sharing it, Sarah.
Yeah, of course. I had to think a lot about it because I have so many memorable experiences that they tie to the emotional, they tie to the, breathtaking and beautiful, or to an experience I had in a little town or somebody that I met. But I figured that one was a little bit more out of the box, and it was striking to me and how different it was.
Next is Ralph Krugler. Ralph is the historian for Hillsborough Inlet Lighthouse in Florida. He works for the U.S. Lighthouse Society, entering photos and documents into our online research catalog, and he helps with social media and other projects. Here's Ralph. Could you tell us about your favorite lighthouse experience?
It's almost impossible to pick one. I mean, how do
Yeah.
you pick? Is it your first one you went to? Is it seeing the ghost at St. Augustine? I mean, so many different things, but I kind of want to go with the first one because I was a little kid, and when you're a little kid, if you can capture them, because I really want people to understand that the more kids we can get the lighthouse bug, the better off it's going to be for all of us.
Yeah.
But actually, I think I'm going to go with the first time I got to go into the lantern at Hillsborough Inlet and actually see the lens up close, face to face for the first time. It's 9 foot in diameter, 357 pieces of glass, one piece of acrylic, and it's just magnificent. And I remember looking at it and seeing it move and watching the whole parts and everything. And I thought of something, and it was funny because I thought I came up with it, but then you also said it too. It's a functional piece of art.
hmm
It's not just a beautiful light and lens, but I mean, it's a work of art. It actually has a function and it's beautiful. And everybody that I get to show it to, they all have the same reaction. It's just this overwhelming look of, oh my gosh. I've seen
Yeah.
it from a distance, but I've never seen it up close before. And it's just that same look when you get out. Like, have you ever been to Ponce Inlet? They have a whole building there of
Yes.
lenses, and they're beautiful, but they're not in, again, take one of yours, in their natural habitat out in
Yep.
the wild where they belong, in the actual lighthouse where they actually served. And when you see it in that spot, it's just overwhelming. It really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And also, obviously, in retrospect, that lens has even more meaning for you now because you've had a kind of a relationship with it in recent years as well. You've cleaned that
Absolutely.
lens multiple times, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I've
And
been
you're
burned by that lens.
seriously?
Oh yeah. When you get in between there, if you're wearing shorts and the sun hits it on just the right spot, it's a magnifying glass on your leg. Yeah. So I've gotten
Okay.
little burns on my leg before.
Wow. That's like badges of honor in a way.
Pretty much.
Yeah. You get the Lighthouse Purple Heart for that, I think. Lenses can have an effect on people. They are.
Absolutely. Every size has got a different shape different type, whether it's a beehive, whether it's clamshell, whether it's,
Yeah.
whether it's rotating or if it's fixed, or, just the design of the framework itself. I mean, they're
Yeah.
all just beautiful.
It's like lighthouses. There's so many different kinds. I think people who don't know anything about them think a lighthouse is a lighthouse, but
Right.
not really. And same thing with the lenses. Yeah. They'll have their own look and their own story to tell for sure. So Ralph, that's great. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The next interviewee is Shalana Malard. Shalana is a writer and lighthouse aficionado living in Washington, D.C. She was one of the podcast's first regular listeners, and she's co-hosted a couple of times. So here's Shalana. So, Shalana, nice to see you again. Thank you for doing this today. So I just have one question for you, okay? And that question is, what has been your most memorable lighthouse experience?
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I'm so glad to join you today. Thank you for having me. My most memorable lighthouse experience is my very first visit to Apse Lighthouse. As I reflect on that, I think, I got up that morning and it was just the general excitement of going to my first lighthouse. I'd been wanting to do that for so long. So I got up that morning, was so excited. But outside of just that, excitement, one of the things that stands out to me that day is the camaraderie among other people who were visiting the lighthouse. So at Apse, it's 228 steps. Their tagline is 228 steps, one amazing journey. And as you go up, they have multiple landings that you can stop and, take a rest and maybe look out the window, get a different view of Atlantic City, and then continue. And what I remember so much about that day was as I was making my way up, I had stopped at one of the landings, to catch my breath. And there were a few folks coming down. They'd been to the top. They were making their way back down. And they just looked at me and they said, the view up there is so worth it. And I just love that encouragement. It's like, there were these were other people that had already been up there and they were coming back down and they saw someone making their way up and they were encouraging me, saying, the view up there is so worth it. And that just gave me that extra push that I needed to continue that climb up those 228 steps. And so I made my way to the top and they were absolutely correct. The view is so worth it. The other thing that stands out to me about that day was Buddy Grover, the late Buddy Grover. He was the lightkeeper on duty that day when I made my first climb, and I made my way to the top. And just immediately you got this sense that he was someone who truly was passionate about the lighthouse, obviously very knowledgeable. In life, there are some people that immediately when you encounter them, this is someone that I'm going to remember. And Buddy was that person, and just so enthusiastic and knowledgeable about the lighthouse. And I still have my first, I saw the light card that he happened to sign that day. So just encountering him. And by the way, I love, the tribute that you paid to him during the recent virtual telethons. That was awesome. So those are really some of the things that stood out to me about my first visit to Apse.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah. So I got to go there for the first time myself this past May.
Oh,
And
awesome.
yeah, I was there at a time when I don't think there was anybody else going up or down the time I happened to be there, but the staff, the volunteers there were just fantastic. Everybody was so nice and welcoming. And I've featured Apse on the podcast a few times now. And I had Buddy Grover, that was legendary volunteer. He, I believe, passed away within this past year at 96. I believe it was 96.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. And just an incredible guy, such an optimistic, cheerful kind of guy. And I'm so happy I had him on the podcast as well.
Absolutely. Apse is just an amazing place. And one other visit, my third visit there also stands out to me. That was a nighttime climb. And during that one, I saw that the lighthouse really does take on a different feel at night. They had a full moon climb and I've always wanted to do that. So I went to Atlantic City just for that. And boy, did the lighthouse take on a different feel at night. So that visit also stands out to me. But that very first one is what is truly magical.
It's interesting that both Shalana and Sarah mentioned Apse Lighthouse in New Jersey as a peak experience. It's a great one for sure, with a group of very capable and hospitable staff and volunteers. Next is Ben Ridings. Ben is the curator for Cape May MAC, the organization that manages the Cape May Lighthouse in New Jersey. I met him when I interviewed him at Cape May Lighthouse, and since then he's co-hosted a couple of times, including just 2 episodes ago. So here's Ben.
Only one question for you today, and that question is, what has been your most memorable lighthouse experience?
I was thinking about this, and I guess by definition, it would have to be my first lighthouse experience. To set the scene, when I was 3, my parents purchased a little, what we call shore house in New Jersey, a little beach house on the Wildwoods in New Jersey, which is just a barrier island. And, we spent the summers there. That's where we went on vacation. My friends went throughout the country. The only flying I ever did as a kid was in the family station wagon. So we'd go there, and they were looking for things to do. And one time we came across the Hereford Inlet Lighthouse, which I believe you spoke to someone connected to this lighthouse in an episode of your podcast.
Yes, I did, on my trip down, the same trip where I interviewed you at Cape May. Yeah, that was a great stop.
For those of you that don't know, the Hereford Inlet Lighthouse is one of those where the home is built around the light. It doesn't have a separate tower. So I think the lighthouse was constructed about 1874, and it was furnished for the period, photos, furniture. And I just remember at a young age, maybe 5, 6, or 7, I was completely captivated. I think it was my first experience at a museum. It's certainly the first one I remember. And it left an impression on my mind. It's hard to convey, but it almost was like that was the moment that history came alive for me. My imagination ran wild. I pictured, my family in that lighthouse, during storms and just living there.
Yeah.
And even at a young age, I just sensed the significance of the place.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a strange twist for you, Jeremy. My first museum experience was in an 1873 lighthouse. Now, working as curator for Cape May MAC, we have 3 historic sites, 2 of which are a lighthouse and an 1879 house museum. Mm-hmm. So it's just fascinating how that first experience, and now, 30 some odd years later, it's like, oh, it's kind of the same thing in a way.
Do you think that kind of directly or indirectly led to your that impression that Hereford Inlet Lighthouse made on you? Did that enter into you going into your present position, do you think?
I believe so, because even as a kid, who knows what games kids play, but for me, my games is always like, oh, I'm going to pretend like I go back in time. And I think maybe that visiting that museum kind of started everything. Mm-hmm. And just that thought process, and all of a sudden, I'm working at a history museum in a house. So it's in a lighthouse. So it's just interesting.
The next guest is Emily Strait. Emily is the co-host of the podcast The Lighthouse Lowdown, and she's been a guest and co-host of Lighthearted. Emily is a chemical engineer and a stained glass artist on the side. Here's Emily.
What has been your most memorable lighthouse experience?
So I had to give this one some thought. I haven't really been to that many lighthouses, considering, that we have a podcast about it. And Vince and I recently got to go to Cape Cod, and that's where we visited a lot of our lighthouses. And it was the first time Vince climbed a lighthouse. So that was really cool. I had climbed one just the weekend before that for the first time. So a lot of firsts, and we've only had a couple years of going to lighthouses. So recently went to Cape Cod, went to Provincetown,
mm-hmm.
and we wanted to go see Wood End and Long Point Lighthouse, which are on Long Point. And to get there, you either take a little shuttle or you do a pretty long walk across breakwater. Yeah. And we didn't know that it was going to be so intensive. We didn't know it was going to be such a long, kind of like a hike. And, some people are like, oh, we do this in sandals. It's no big deal. And so we really weren't prepared for how much effort it was going to be to get out there, but it was really worth it. Hiked across the breakwater, had to get through some brush. Luckily, we're wearing pants. We know that ticks are like a big thing in Massachusetts in the summer. So we're wearing pants and tennis shoes, which was lucky for us. But I went out to Wood End. It seemed very remote, just in the middle of nowhere. And it was kind of bittersweet getting out there because it really shows what happens to a lighthouse when nobody's caring for it. It's really just beat up, the elements have taken their toll. And so we kind of just had a moment out there, just kind of saddened by what happens when there's not someone taking care of our lighthouses. And then we went across the beach, saw some seals, saw lots of seashells, saw some national park rangers taking down signs for bird nesting. It was the end of nesting season, I suppose. So we saw them out there, but then went over to Long Point Lighthouse, which is identical to Wood End and seems to be more taken care of. I'm not sure if someone's like cleaning it up or taking care of it, but I know Wood End had the door broken in. I don't know if it's from the elements or from somebody who did that themselves, but the door was broken in, so the inside looked a lot worse. But it looks like Long Point had a little bit more care surrounding it and more people on the beach over there because you can take the shuttle. It's a little bit easier to make your way out there. So we got to see both of those and kind of see the difference between them depending on how often people are around.
Next is Bob Trapani, Jr. Regular listeners are familiar with Bob, who's been a guest and co-host several times. He even interviewed me once. Bob is the executive director of the American Lighthouse Foundation, and he's also a technician for the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Plus, he's a great friend I've known for almost 25 years. Here's Bob.
What has been your favorite, or I don't know if you can say the favorite, but what comes to mind when I ask you about a favorite lighthouse experience you've had?
It's funny. I thought about that and I said, oh my goodness, you have these experiences where there's thrills and adventure, where there's fascination and intrigue. And of course, a ton of fun with so many people and places. And I'm like, well, what would stand out? And I came up with one, and I think the word I would come up with is astonishment. And it was February 14th, 2015. We had a blizzard along the mid-coast the night before. And I got up early that morning on the 14th, Valentine's Day, and I wanted to go over to the Rockland Breakwater, and I wasn't sure what I was going to see. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see. But what I saw, I did not expect to see. It was truly astonishing. The entire breakwater covered in ice, and not just a little layer of ice, but at least 6 inches of ice. And I just could not believe my eyes. It was otherworldly. It was like, I've not seen it before. And of course, I've not seen it since. And the other aspect that stuck with me was that it wasn't a one-day experience. That ice stuck around for 5-6 weeks. And when I would go out there in the mornings, especially thereafter that 14th, it was interesting. Some days you'd see these incredible hoarfrost patterns on the ice. Other days, the breakwater would be almost like the vapor on it was steaming as the sun was rising. And then the ice itself would change in formations as well. And I believe some of that had to do with the tides that occasionally would be flooding over or what have you. But boy, not only was it a wonder in nature, but I think for me, it immediately brought to mind, my goodness, the lighthouse keepers. I read about accounts in 1900, 1904 when things would freeze over out there. And you think about the harshness, the cold, and then also the house itself. That east side, because of the way the seas were coming from the northeast, it was all encased in ice. And I could think of, well, if the lighthouse keeper had to be out there trying to get those windows open, or were they using picks and things of that nature to break those open, to get the ice off the lantern? It was just an incredible experience that kept on giving for, like I said, for weeks on end, until the final parts of that, when the breakwater started to melt a little bit. You started to get concerned that all those big cracks and crevices of if you put your foot through one of them, you'd go right through at the end. So it made walking out there even not as enjoyable. You really had to really be careful where you were stepping. And fortunately, I kind of know the breakwater pretty well, and I knew if you stayed close to the edges, it would be fine. And then the other aspect of that ice was it wasn't slippery. People would expect ice, of course, to be slippery, but I don't know if it was mixed with the salt and what have you, but it was not slippery. And I think that experience was so riveting because it surprised me. I've never seen it since. That's probably one that sticks out in my mind, just from a pure astonishment perspective.
Okay. It makes me think of a couple of things. One is that you see these pictures every winter of lighthouses on the Great Lakes looking like ice castles, completely covered, which the Great Lakes, I think, it's more common because obviously it's fresh water and the ice, it just forms ice more easily on structures like that. With the salt water, it tends not to do that. So that is really, really unusual. It also reminds me of a time Willie Williams, the longtime keeper of Boone Island, was out there for like almost 30 years. He described seeing one time everything on the island like covered with ice. Like he said, it was very magical on one winter morning. So I think of that.
Yeah, another thing I remember about it is I remember thinking to myself, it feels like, not that I would know the course, but it's just from pictures, it's like, man, am I on the moon or something? I mean, this is like, it was just an unbelievable, like I said, otherworldly. But yeah, I mean, I've seen that breakwater inundated with tides and the seas breaking over it, and it's just wild out there. But yeah, that was just amazing. And then the other part of that is we haven't seen ice like that in Penobscot Bay. Of course, it wasn't icy in the harbor that year so much, but it was like 1977 since the last time an icebreaker had to break open Penobscot Bay to get the ferries to run back and forth. So again, yeah, it was cold and all, but you just didn't expect to go there and see something like that. So true spectacle, a true memory. And it did harken my mind back to those stories that we hear in wintertime with lighthouse keepers.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also I'm thinking how you yourself, with your photography and your writing and everything, you tend to make that connection between lighthouses and nature and weather and all that. You notice those kind of details. So it makes sense that would be one of your top experiences.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to me, lighthouses are a grand part of the seascape, and the seascape, of course, embodies the sea, the islands, a breakwater in this case, of course, the lighthouse, and the stories and the history. So yeah, it all comes together. And you think when you're out there in those kinds of moments, you are getting to see shadows of what the lighthouse keepers saw on a fairly regular basis. I mean, you mentioned Keeper Williams at Boone Island and how long he had been in a place like that. Imagine what he saw. I mean, all the things he saw, the nightly sunsets, of course, the storms, stories about the birds flying into the lantern, just unbelievable stuff and maybe sometimes once and never again. That's the other cool part about that kind of thing. I don't know if in my lifetime I'll ever see something quite like that at Rockland Breakwater. So, yeah, they're special. And when you see those moments, they make an indelible mark in your mind.
The next segment is with Cindy Johnson. Along with Michelle Jewell Shaw, Cindy is one of the original co-hosts of Lighthearted, and she's been part of more than 100 episodes. She's a past winner of the American Lighthouse Foundation's Len Hadley Volunteerism Award, and she has served as the operations manager for Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. She's a great co-host and a great friend. Here's Cindy. You know the game plan for today. I only have one question for you, okay? This time, I know usually you've helped me introduce guests and so forth, but for the moment, you are the guest here. So,
oh boy.
Yeah, I only have...
That just made me nervous.
No. You know how it is. It's always a friendly conversation here. So, just one question for you, okay? What has been your most memorable lighthouse experience?
Aha. Okay. So this is a tough one for any lighthouse lover because there are so many, or at least a handful that come to mind right away. I think on past podcast episodes, I have talked about at least 2 or 3, but I actually have a more recent one I'd like to share. I know for sure that I haven't shared this one because it is pretty recent.
Okay.
So last summer, like summer 2023, I had the opportunity to go out on a little boat there, from the seacoast of New Hampshire. So from Portsmouth out to the Isles of Shoals. And even though I've lived in the seacoast of New Hampshire region for a long time, I've lived several places, but probably the longest is the seacoast of New Hampshire. Well, even though I've been there a while, and obviously worked with and volunteered for Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses, the lighthouse that we take care of in Newcastle. I've actually never been all the way out to the Isles of Shoals. A strip of islands about what, Jeremy, 7-8 miles out, if that?
Less than that to the town of Rye, but about 6 or so miles out from Portsmouth, basically.
From Portsmouth,
Yeah.
okay.
Group of 9 islands, very historic and very beautiful group of islands. Yeah.
And the southern islands are in New Hampshire, and the border runs through them, and the northern islands are actually in the state of Maine.
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay, so I had the opportunity to hop on a friend's boat last summer, like I said, from Portsmouth straight out to the Isles of Shoals. And for the first time ever, I got to see White Island Light on White Island, which is technically in Rye, New Hampshire, but out there on the Isles of Shoals. I'd only ever seen it either squinting on a clear day from the seacoast of New Hampshire, or not squinting through some binoculars, but I'd never seen it up close. I had just never gone out there on a boat. That was super exciting for me because we only have 2 coastal lighthouses in the whole state of New Hampshire. And here's the one that I've been, we've been taking care of and volunteering for all these years. But the only other coastal lighthouse in our state I'd never actually been out to. So of course we couldn't land the boat or go up into it or anything like that. But just to be able to see it really up close from the boat, and it was nice. The water was nice and calm, and just I think it was around 5 or so in the evening. So it's just like a with a cool breeze, nice summer day, and be able to see this beautiful lighthouse up close, finally in person, instead of just your photographs and postcards and all of that. That was awesome. That was really awesome. And then, of course, sort of cruising around the different Isles of Shoals from there. And then I wasn't expecting this to happen on this little boat ride at all. But then we actually proceeded up the coast, and we went all the way up to York, Maine. And I, for the first time ever, got to see one of my favorite, one of the most photographed lighthouses in the world, right? Cape Nettic Light,
AKA Nubble,
AKA the Nubble Light. I actually have never seen it I've seen it more times than I could count, but I had never seen it from the water, which means I'd never seen the backside of the Nubble.
The backside.
So,
okay.
Seeing it from the water, I guess you could say I also saw Boone Island Light way off in the distance. We didn't go out there in this little boat because that's actually a ways out. I think it's 8 miles out from Cape Nettic there, and can be pretty rough out there. And this was a pretty small boat. That was not part of the plan. But yes, going all the way up from the Isles of Shoals past Kittery Point into York, and in that little area of York, Cape Nettic, and then seeing the Nubble from the water was awesome, because I've just seen it so many times from the parking lot where we all go, the park, to look at the Nubble from that side.
Yeah, and you would have seen Whaleback Lighthouse too, of course, in Kittery going.
And absolutely, definitely on the way out to the Isles of Shoals, we were really close to Whaleback Light, which is also really, really, really cool.
Going back, more than 30 years, I've done that route a number of times, but I don't get tired of it at all. It's a great area to cruise around, and those lighthouses are just so beautiful. So I'm happy for you that you got to do that.
Thank you. Yes, I've had some different experiences with being on some rough boats growing up with seasickness and stuff, where it just led to this sort of phobia of not of boats, not of water, just a pure like seasickness type of phobia. Worrying about the possibility of seasickness kept me from going out too far on boats. But I guess I just felt comfortable enough in this situation because I was friends with the person driving the boat that I could say, you know what, let's turn around. Not something that you could do on a boat that had other paying customers or something on it. So I just felt comfortable enough, and it was a calm day, and it all just really worked out that day. So that was a really cool experience.
The next guest is Rob Apse. Rob co-hosted a couple of episodes in the early days of Lighthearted, and he produced a nice little promo video for the podcast. Rob is a filmmaker and writer who produced the award-winning documentary film, The Last Lightkeepers. He's also generously shared his drone footage of lighthouses with the U.S. Lighthouse Society. Here's Rob. Please tell me about your most memorable lighthouse experience.
Yeah, for me, not all of my lighthouse experiences, but a majority of them have been from behind the lens when I was filming my documentary, and when I look back at all those different moments, on camera and off camera, the experiences were always with someone at a lighthouse, and originally that started with you, Jeremy, learning about lighthouses and lighthouse history, the first time I started making this documentary, The Last Lightkeepers, and we were inside Portsmouth Harbor Light, and I think I held you hostage for 6 hours or something like that, and you gave me all this history, and I always think about that first moment, or spending the night on Thatcher Island with former president of the Thatcher Island Association, Paul St. Germain, and walking the island at night as a storm came in and the fog rolled in real fast, or being with Fred Mickelson and him pulling out his old film reels of being at Connecticut, standing inside Dave Waller's first order lens when he just built it and hadn't moved it out to Graves Light. I think that's really the amazing thing about, the universe of lighthouses and all these different worlds that exist within each individual lighthouse. But it's always that human element and that story and those people that carry on the traditions. That's really amazing. But if I had to pick one, and it's probably no surprise to you, it would be my, experience at Halfway Rock with owner Ford Reike. I call it my welcome to offshore lighthouse experience. It was one of the first times I went out to Halfway Rock. And if anyone who has seen Halfway Rock or been out in Casco Bay, it's surrounded 360 degrees by crashing waves. And to land on Halfway Rock, you take a little inflatable and you gun it up the boat ramp he has there, which is mossy and greasy. And if you step on that during low tide, you're going to fall right on your butt. And so, I had all my camera gear with me, and we had been filming all day at the lighthouse, and it was time to leave, and the tide went out. So the inflatable was about 30 feet from the water, and you're not going to walk that boat down because you're going to fall into the rocks, into the waves. And so I was the last one to hop in the boat with Ford, and he said, just give it a little push and jump in. And it was like jumping onto a toboggan, and we rode that boat down the ramp. And we had hit a piece of, maybe an old rebar or old iron or something that was holding, the previous boat ramps that have been washed away over the years. And it stopped the boat short, and I went flying on my head. I did not expect that. And, I had all my camera gear, and we had to step out of the boat, and we were in knee deep water, crashing waves, and we had to turn the boat around and get back in, and it's losing air. And I thought, this is where I'm going to lose all my camera gear. But that was my welcome to lighthouse experience. I think it was very early in my journey of filmmaking, in the documentary. And so that was, I realized I had to get boots. I had to get some watertight gear to protect my camera, but nothing was we were never really in any danger, but it was an interesting experience for me. And I'll always remember that. And, when I tell people that story, they think I'm crazy for laughing about it. And, but it was such a blast, and I had so much fun filming, but it gave me a lot of respect for lighthouses, the ocean, and those who used to man the lighthouse. They went out there and probably way less gear than we had and way less power, but they had to go out there no matter what. And so it made me, I feel like I earned some respect going out there and experiencing lighthouses that way.
Yeah. And of course, some of that experience from that day is actually in your film, The Last Lightkeepers, right?
That's right. Landing on there and drone shots of others landing. And I wish, it was another lesson for me was to go get a GoPro that next day and always be filming, because you just never know what you were going to experience. And so I made sure I had a GoPro, something that was a little more waterproof than my DSLR camera and some of my other gear. So it was such a fun time, and I'm very grateful for Ford taking me out there and being able to include him in the film. But just experiencing that is something I know 99.9% of the population never gets a chance to. And I think it's a really cool thing when you go out to some of these lighthouses, even ones that are onshore, you can have such an amazing experience being out there, one of a kind.
The next guest is Avery Shaughnessy-Comfort. Avery is the executive director of the Presque Isle Light Station in Pennsylvania. She's been an interviewee and a co-host, and she's also now a regional reporter for this podcast for the Eastern Great Lakes region. Here's Avery.
So, Avery, what has been your most memorable lighthouse experience?
I will say that it's been really hard to select my most memorable lighthouse experience, even in my very short tenure as executive director. I think with the sheer number of people we see over 15,000 people a year. It's hard to pin it down to one thing. But the thing I come back to most is the fact that, my most memorable experience of lighthouses is with our lighthouses at Presque Isle Light Station and Lake Erie Lights. Our lighthouses were closed up to the public for so long. The Presque Isle Light Station wasn't available to be visited until 2015, and then the Erie Land Lighthouse wasn't overly accessible until 2021. There were periods of accessibility until before then, but this is really the time when it's been the most accessible. And when people come to the lighthouse, especially from the local area, and they tell me that this is their first time there, or they've never been able to go inside, but they've seen it for years, and then they finally get to experience it, and just watching their reactions is really special. Just learning how they grew up with the space, especially in the Erie Land Lighthouse, as it's been a fixture in that neighborhood for so many years. And for people to say, I finally got to go in, is really, really special to me. And I think with our volunteers, we have over 100 volunteers with the organization that have seen the lighthouses through good times and bad, and finally in some really good times with the restoration of both lighthouses, and hopefully a third lighthouse with the North Pier Light, seeing their reactions to the changes and the work we've done along the way has impacted me more than I ever thought it would. So I think that is the most memorable experience for me, especially as a director of a lighthouse organization.
Sure. Yeah, you're making me think that the most memorable experience can take all kinds of forms, and that's how I mean this to be. It's it's to be a wide open question, and there is no incorrect answer, that's for sure. So I completely understand where you're coming from with that, and that it's got to be, I don't know if satisfying is quite the right word, but kind of heartwarming in a way.
It makes you feel like the work that you've been doing, or the work that all these volunteers have been doing for so many years, is finally worth it whenever a visitor gets to say, oh, I finally got to see it after years of not being able to. Makes you feel like you've done something right.
Next is Jen Lewis. Jen has been part of several episodes as a guest and as co-host. Jen is the outreach manager for the Point Cabrillo Lightkeepers Association on the Northern California coast. Here's Jen. Jen, hi, how are you?
Doing so good, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. So it's pretty straightforward today. I have one question for you, one question only, and that question is, what has been your favorite lighthouse experience, or your most memorable lighthouse experience?
Okay. So this one is a hard one for me, Jeremy, because 2024 was the year of lighthouses for me. I've had so many cool experiences. The top of the list for sure is my visit out to the St. George Reef Lighthouse offshore of Crescent City, California, earlier this year. I spent Memorial Day weekend out on this rock. So 3 nights, 4 days out at the St. George Reef Lighthouse, helping them lead tours and clean up the lighthouse and just make it ready for all the efforts that they have coming in the future, all their preservation efforts coming up. And that experience was something I never even dreamed that I'd be able to do. Spending the night out at St. George was so incredible. Just truly something that was a bucket list item for me. And folks that are members of the U.S. Lighthouse Society will get to read about my experience in the most recent episode or issue of the Keeper's Log. But just as a little bit of something, just spending the night out there and listening to the stellar sea lions as the sun went down, and just listening to that constant roar of the ocean, just surrounded by the Pacific Ocean on every side. It is something that will live in my brain forever. It was such an incredible experience. But I was really, really lucky later in the year, too, because this August, I spent a week up on the Olympic Peninsula up in Washington, a little further up on the West Coast, and got to visit a ton of lighthouses. I visited Point No Point, which, of course, is the headquarters for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. the Skunk Bay Lighthouse, Point Wilson, Gray's Harbor, and got to see Cape Disappointment and Destruction Island from shore. Of course, I didn't get to visit those islands. But one of the coolest parts of that adventure was in Westport, Washington, at the Westport Maritime Museum. They have the First Order Fresnel lens from the Destruction Island Lighthouse. And this is a museum that I have wanted to visit for a very, very long time. And John Shaw, the executive director out there, gave us a tour of the museum, and walking into the room where they house the First Order Fresnel lens, when he opened those doors, I teared up because it's such a beautiful thing to see. I mean, I know you love Fresnel lenses as much as I love Fresnel lenses, as do all the listeners of this podcast. But seeing that First Order Fresnel lens on display in the center of this room that was built for it was a heavenly experience, especially when he turned it on and it actually does rotate on that display with all the light, shining on the walls out there as he shared the history of Destruction Island with us. Man, 2024 was a good year, Jeremy.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. I saw that. I went to that museum in Westport and saw that lens several years ago, and your description was absolutely perfect. Heavenly is a great word for it, because the way the light is radiating out in the walls and everything, it's kind of ethereal like, and
Totally.
it took my breath away, just
really
like you.
does. It really does. I mean, just as soon as those doors open, like the gasp that came out of my mouth, just the fact that you can walk all the way around it, and that lens is in such incredible shape too. I mean, it's just pristine.
Yeah.
They do such a good job of taking care of it and showcasing it. And I was just very, very impressed by that display.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jen. And I hope I'll get to St. George Reef myself. That almost was going to happen this past year. I hope it's going to happen next year, and maybe I'll see you out there when I'm there.
I believe it. I hope to see you there.
Next is Michelle Jewell Shaw, who is one of the original co-hosts of Lighthearted. Like Cindy, Michelle has co-hosted more than 100 episodes. She's a special ed teacher at Rochester Middle School in Rochester, New Hampshire. She's a past winner of the American Lighthouse Foundation's Len Hadley Volunteerism Award, and she serves as the chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses in New Hampshire. She's also a great friend. So here's Michelle. So good to talk to you as always, Michelle. And you know that for today, we just have one question. So the question is, what has been your most memorable lighthouse experience?
So there's lots, but I think the one that sticks out most in my mind is this was probably 4 or 5 years ago. I was just starting to get into photography at the time and working with nighttime photography. And I decided to take my camera to Nubble Light one night. It was around midnight. It was during a high tide, and it was during a king tide, no less. And back then I was pretty adventurous about climbing down on the rocks and, to get that perfect shot. And I really wanted to get close down on the rocks so I could get a good, some good star pictures behind the Nubble. So I was down on the rocks, very low on the rocks. And as I said, it was a king high tide and the waves were pretty big. And I just remember at one point, I could see this giant wave getting ready to break on the rocks. And the only way I could see, it was like there was a full moon. So the waves were kind of down at that level. They were kind of lit by the moon. And I just see this wave coming at me. And it wasn't as big as I thought it was, but it washed over my feet. And the one I saw coming after that, I thought, I better go up to higher ground because I could very quickly, be swept out to sea here. So I think that probably is my biggest lighthouse memory. It was such an adrenaline rush to be down there in the waves, and of course there was a little bit of fear, but mostly excitement at that time. I honestly don't know that I would do that now because as you know, I'm very accident prone these days. So, my luck, I would probably slip and fall on the rocks and, knock myself out. But that was a pretty big, that will always stay in my mind. That was pretty exciting.
I can see how that would. I've been there and seen people down on those rocks at times when they really shouldn't have been, when the waves are splashing
Yeah.
all around them, and it scares me. It's like I can't look at them.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And I
I'm
was all
very,
by myself. There was nobody else around.
yeah,
So, it was one of those things that, like I said, it was just a huge adrenaline rush and
yeah.
it was just so exciting. But then, in retrospect, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that.
Yeah, yeah,
But
no, I understand completely, and I consider myself also accident prone. So I'm, and I'm not getting any younger either. So I tend to be very careful in those situations these days.
right.
Where years ago I might have been a little more reckless. But you got to
Yeah.
be careful. That's the safety first all the
Yes.
time. But
Yes.
I can understand how that'd be a very memorable experience.
Yeah.
So thank you, Michelle. And obviously
You're
we'll be
welcome.
talking again soon. And thank you for all you've done for the podcast over these years.
I love doing the podcast.
Next is Judianne Point. Judianne is the first vice president of the American Lighthouse Foundation. She serves as tour director, events coordinator, and museum docent for the Friends of Palm Rocks Lighthouse in Rhode Island. In addition to occasionally serving as co-host, Judianne is the Southern New England reporter for this podcast. Here's Judianne. The big question of the day is, what is your most memorable lighthouse experience?
Well, I decided to go with the hardest lighthouse to get to theme. Now, I suppose Matinicus and Mount Desert Island lighthouses could qualify. A couple of weeks ago, Gary and I saw them on your Mid-Coast Maine 16 Lighthouse tour that you and Bob Trapani hosted.
Yeah.
But I had nothing to do with getting there. Okay. It was the captain and crew and the perfect weather. So I'm going to go with Saugerties Lighthouse on the Hudson River in New York as the most difficult lighthouse to get to so far. We'd looked into staying at Saugerties overnight last fall, but there were no vacancies. So we decided we're still going to include it on our Hudson Lighthouse trip. So we started out at Hudson Athens and we worked our way south to Saugerties. After that, we had reservations to take a solar boat ride. It was with the Hudson River Maritime Museum. That was an amazing trip. We saw Esopus Meadows and Rondout. And eventually we stayed a couple nights in Sleepy Hollow and saw Tarrytown. So let's go back to the beginning of the trip. We're at Hudson Athens. We work our way down to Saugerties. We knew that we might have a high tide to contend with. Before this trip, I never knew the Hudson River had a tide. And so you had to contend with that because there's a wooded path that leads to the lighthouse. But we figured, hey, we're on a schedule here. Maybe we'll luck out. So we started the trek on the head of the trail. We met a few others who started out before us. And we read that there were some rubber boots that could be available at the beginning of the trail. Of course, there were none there. But, we both had our boots on. They were maybe like 8 inches high. So we figured, hey, we rolled up our pants just in case. And then we took off. The first 100 yards of the trip were dry. So we figured, hey, this looks easy. But as we progressed, we met all the other people who left before us that were heading on the way back. And they suggested that, I wouldn't continue if I were you because everything is underwater. Well, we were undaunted. We said, hey, we've come this far. We're just going to keep going. So we continued and we came to a footbridge that was actually underwater and said, okay, here we go. Gary went first. And the further we got, the deeper the water became until it was at this point above our knees. We literally could have used hip boots, but I kept holding on to tree branches along the side just so that I could be sure of my footing and know where I was stepping, because I have gone up rivers on the rocks. So I know on canoe trips. So I held on to the tree branches. We finally got to the lighthouse and realized that we were the only 2 idiots out there. So we were happy, but we were happy. We got our photos in. So we turned to head back, and there's this wooden bridge, like wooden ramp that leads away from the lighthouse and goes back to the path. But at this point, we couldn't see the entire ramp because the whole thing's underwater. Gary walked ahead, and he made it okay. But of course, I misstepped. And the next thing I knew, my left foot ended up in the river. I'm up to my left hip in water. My right knee is still on the ramp, and I'm holding my right arm up in the air trying to keep my phone dry. Wow. I remember screaming, help me, please. Like there was nobody around for 2 miles. Of course, Gary's like 2 feet ahead of me. So he just reaches back and he grabs my arm and brings me back up on the ramp. And as we slogged back to the car, we also noticed that we had these very sharp little black seed pods that were stuck to our boots and to our pants. I'm like, what the heck are these? Later on, the next day when we got to Esopus and we talked to the people at the Maritime Museum, they said that there are these black seed pods from the water chestnut plant. It's an ornamental plant that was imported in the 19th century. And it is just so invasive right now on the Hudson River. And these darn things are sharp. But anyway, as I said, we got back to the car, and all in all, I mean, we had a good laugh when we got back. And it was worth it because we got to see such a great lighthouse, but I could not wait to get back and dry out at the hotel. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That is a great story. I've been there to Saugerties Lighthouse in 2007, or was it 8? But I was working on a book on Hudson River and New York Harbor lighthouses. When I walked out, there was just a little bit of water. I did make sure I walked out at low tide.
Well, we were on a schedule. We said, what the heck?
Yeah.
As long as I didn't get up to my neck, I figured I'd be good.
Well, you made it. That's the important
We
thing.
made it. Yes, we did.
Yeah.
It was an accomplishment.
Yeah, it's a great lighthouse. Patrick Landaway, the caretaker there, the resident caretaker, has been on the podcast. He's a great guy.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we loved it.
And again, those are the types of experiences you're not going to forget. The business to lighthouses on beautiful days, you might remember the lighthouse, but not the circumstances. But you're going to.
Oh, no. And Gary got great photos. He didn't get a photo of me in the water. Maybe we should go back and recreate it. But, it was it was good. It was fun.
No, you don't need to do that. Thank you, Judianne.
My pleasure, Jeremy.
Next, we have a mother-daughter team from Kentucky. Heather Porter contacted me last year and asked if I could wish a happy 11th birthday to her daughter, Guinevere. Both of them are big Lighthouse fans. Since then, they've taken part in the podcast several times, and I got to spend some time with them when they came up my way for a New England trip this past spring. Here are Gwyn and her mom, Heather. What has been your most memorable Lighthouse experience?
Probably Go Island, because the people there were really nice. Well, they let us go into the lighthouse, which is super nice. They let us stay there as long as we needed. They gave us a boat ride over there. They let us see their dogs. It was super memorable. Scott was super nice. He felt like a papaw to me, and I loved it so much. He was amazing.
That's great. Yeah, I was with you, of course, and then you talked about Goat Island in Kennebunkport, Maine. Then we ate at the Chowder House right there near the pier. So, Mom, Heather, how about you?
I think just the whole New England trip in general was awesome. Like, after listening to the podcast for years and then actually slowly getting into it, but then being able to see, it sounds like I'm fangirling, but it's not. But being able to see my favorite lighthouse with the podcast host that I had listened to forever.
This is Portland Head you're talking about now, right?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Portland Head. And then being able to climb it and see it and just really appreciate it was just amazing. And then the whole day was just lighthouses and the whole trip was amazing. But I think Portland Head was my favorite. It was just one that I never thought I would be able to climb. It's hard. I didn't think I would be able to see it again. And it was so nice.
Yeah, Portland Head is very special to a lot of people. So I'm just wondering, before we end this little conversation, if you anything else about just getting into lighthouses in general, what is it meant to you, do you think?
I feel like seeing the lighthouses is a really good way to connect with someone. Starting a conversation, also you can ask someone what their favorite lighthouse is, what you like about it. When me and my friend went to Florida and Georgia, we went and we saw a bunch of lighthouses. 7 or 8. And 7 or 8 lighthouses. And I know I talked about this before, but it was really fun. And afterwards, that's all we could talk about on the vacation. When are we going to see the next lighthouse? What was your favorite part of that one? We have a couple pictures of us in the lighthouses hanging up in our house. It was amazing. But I just feel like it's a really good way to connect with someone.
Yeah. And I had you and your friend, of course, on the podcast talking about your lighthouse visits, including Tybee, right? Tybee Island. Yeah. People can't see it. People can't see us right now, but I'm wearing my Savannah hoodie at the moment. So I love that area too. It's a great area, great bunch of lighthouses around there. Heather, anything you want to add to what Gwyn just said?
I just when I think of lighthouses, for me, it's mostly the history. And some of them are in rough shape, but they have withstood so much. Like Portsmouth Harbor in rough shape, but it has been, it's been worse, been better. but it's going to get through it with y'all's help. And it's just, you can learn a lot from a lighthouse.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that might sound silly, or I don't know, but you can weather a storm just like a lighthouse through. I mean, some of these lighthouses are so old and they're still standing, and it's just, I love to look at them and just think of everything they've seen and everything they've been through and come out the other side.
I like it. Yeah, resilience, I think, is one of the things people feel lighthouses stand for. So that's beautifully said.
Also, I feel that seeing everyone else get so excited about lighthouses is also something that just makes me very happy. Like my sister, my brother, they would be so excited to see him. They would rush up ahead of us. We would have to tell them to slow down, but they were like, no, I just want to reach the top.
Yeah, got to start them young.
Yeah. Cape May was my 3-year-old's first lighthouse. He climbed the whole thing by himself and was so proud of himself, and I think he has the lighthouse bug now.
Our last segment is with Jeff Gales, who has been Executive Director of the U.S. Lighthouse Society since 2005. He's also been a good friend, and I'm grateful that Jeff gave the green light to start this podcast back in 2019. Let's listen to Jeff. So, Jeff, thank you so much for being with me today. Always a pleasure, of course. And I think you know what the question at hand is. I've been asking people for the 300th episode. That question is, what has been your most memorable lighthouse experience?
Well, actually, I have 2 memorable experiences. I hope you don't mind if I mention them both.
Well, you're the director, so I'll let it go.
You know, when I first got involved with lighthouses and this whole subject, I didn't know anything about them at all. I'll use a quote that Wayne always said to Wayne Wheeler, our president emeritus, our founder. He always described people that maybe didn't have as much of a knowledge about lighthouse histories. He would always say they don't know lighthouses from outhouses, and that really was me. I knew what the difference between a lighthouse and an outhouse was, but not until I started working at the Point Arena Lighthouse. That was my first lighthouse job. That was back in early 2000s. So I remember learning about the Lighthouse Society because they were in San Francisco, and I was working out there on site in Mendocino County, and I basically fell in love with the subject by the sheer fact that I was at a lighthouse living on site. It's almost hard not to fall in love with the subject when you're experiencing it. I was really experiencing the life of a lighthouse keeper, I would say. And there were many times I'd be at the top of that lighthouse when the place was closed. I would be the only one there. I would be out on the outer gallery looking out over the Pacific Ocean. I might see the Milky Way galaxy. I might see whales off the coast. Just realizing what a special subject this really is, and what a lucky person I am to be experiencing this right at that moment. Little did I know it would end up lasting over 20 years, and hopefully it'll last a lot longer. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, just how I became involved and inspired. It was initially just out of sheer luck I got this job, but then living and working at this lighthouse in Mendocino County gave me the passion that I have today for it. So, and the other thing I wanted to mention is it's kind of a memory of my father, who is passed now. And we were on a family trip. They were on a family trip visiting me in San Francisco, and I started working for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. And we took my dad on a special visit to Point Bonita, which is a beautiful lighthouse at the entrance of the Golden Gate. It involves a fairly steep climb down a hill. You have to walk through a handboard tunnel that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did way back when. You have to walk across a bridge. I mean, it's a effort to get there, but it's so worth it because it's an awesome lighthouse. And my dad decided he was going to do it with me. I wanted to take him on a special trip, a special adventure, but he wore a pacemaker. He had been having heart problems. So we did the whole tour back and forth. He had a great time. He was slow, but had a good time, and it was great. Anyways, he calls me when he got home from the trip back home. He calls me and he says, "You're not going to believe this, that they keep track of people's hearts monitors or the pacemakers when you have them installed. They record the, ups and downs or levels. And he said that on the day that he went to this lighthouse, his doctor mentioned to him, what did you do on that day? Because your heart rate, your health was in optimum territory. He was like the healthiest he had been in years.
Wow.
And that was the day he went and walked down to Point Bonita with me. And it made me realize that lighthouses, lighthouse history, lighthouses in general, there is something, very interesting and magical about them, but they actually can make you healthier.
Yeah. I wonder if it was partly sort of the psychological, the emotional effect. Is that where you're thinking too? Not just the exercise, but.
Well, keep in mind that on a normal day, he wouldn't have walked that far or that steep of a climb to go to, say, a park or to go to a, whatever.
Yeah.
But he did it because it was a lighthouse.
Yeah.
The lighthouse inspired him to go the extra effort.
Yeah.
And when he did that, his body became healthier.
Right.
And that's what I'm trying to say, that literally the act of going to visit a lighthouse can literally make you healthier. And
yeah.
I truly believe that.
Yeah. Well, I think physically and emotionally, I would say.
Absolutely. Both.
Yeah.
Yes.
My sincere thanks to all the co-hosts who have contributed so much to this podcast and who took part in this episode. Maybe it goes without saying, but I want to add a special shout out to my wife, Charlotte, who has co-hosted a couple of times. She's done so much to support this podcast and, of course, all the Lighthouse stuff I've been doing for about 40 years. Obviously, none of this would be possible without her. The question of the day is, what has been your most memorable lighthouse experience? I asked each guest to keep it to one or two experiences, but I'm the host, and I can list as many memorable experiences as I want. I wrote down some off the top of my head. I came up with about 70 without even trying. I actually tried reading all of them as fast as I could, but I realized it would be kind of a cure for insomnia. So instead, I've decided to describe 5 of them in a little more detail. The first happened before I even knew what a lighthouse was. When I was about 6 or 7 years old and living in the Boston area, I went with my family a few times to the Boston Museum of Science. I loved the museum, and one of my favorite things there was the enormous bivalve Fresnel lens from the Navesink Twin Lights in New Jersey. I didn't understand what it was for, but I knew it was very beautiful and it fascinated me. That might have been when I first caught the lighthouse bug, without even knowing it. I really got into lighthouses in a big way in the 1980s. Around 1989 or 90, my wife Charlotte and I spent a night at a B&B in Lubec, Maine. The bed was very uncomfortable and we didn't sleep at all. We finally gave up trying to sleep and went out before sunrise to West Quoddy Headlight at the easternmost point in the United States. At that time, the lighthouse was fenced off to the public. I knew there was nobody there, so we climbed the fence to get a better look at the sunrise. I'll never forget watching that big red sun that morning rise over the horizon as we stood near that beautiful lighthouse. I am not recommending climbing fences like we did, but West Quoddy is now more accessible to the public and there's no longer any need to climb a fence. I'll jump ahead to June 2001. That month I got to ride in a small helicopter with a Coast Guard friend to Graves Light in outer Boston Harbor. We had a great pilot by the name of Dale Hardy. He landed easily on the platform on the side of the granite tower, and we climbed the 30-foot ladder to go inside. When we left, Dale flew around Boston Light, the oldest light station in America, to give me some fantastic aerial views. It was a completely amazing day. Several times I've gotten to spend 2 or 3 nights at Whitehead Light in Maine, a very beautiful island, Whitehead Island. The nonprofit that owns it offers adult education programs, and they've had me go out to lecture about New England lighthouses. I remember one morning at Whitehead, I got up before dawn. I went out and sat on the rocks by myself, and I watched a perfect sunrise. The sea was calm and the air was still, and the only sounds were distant gulls. I watched a lobster boat pass by in the distance. There was nothing really that unusual about it, but it was just perfect in its beauty and simplicity.
In July 2022, I got to take part in the U.S. Lighthouse Society's Ireland tour. One day we went to Cape Clear at the southern tip of Ireland and took a boat ride around the famous Fastnet Lighthouse, which was at the top of my bucket list. I'll never forget seeing that tall tower that looked like it was growing right out of that huge rock. It was extra special to me because I had interviewed Gerald Butler, who served as a keeper there. As you can tell, I've been so lucky to get involved with lighthouses and to visit so many incredible places and experience so many memorable moments. But my most memorable experience has been producing and hosting this podcast for the past 6 years. It's been a complete blast for me. I'm grateful to all the people and organizations who have made this all possible. There are too many to name. Now I want to play another short segment with Jeff Gales reflecting on this podcast. As you know, Jeff, what we're doing now, this recording session, is for the 300th episode of this podcast. We started it back in June of 2019. I'm sure you remember, it seems like yesterday, that I was hired kind of for other things originally, but then we're talking one day and said, how about a podcast? And you love the idea, and so thank you for that. But I'm wondering, 5.5 years and 300 episodes later, any reflections you might have on the podcast?
Well, I'm all about using people and directing them to their strengths. And you, of course, were hired as the Society's historian, but you have a background in broadcast, a strong background in broadcast. And we only usually promoted lighthouse history and lighthouse preservation, even modern happenings at lighthouses, through the written word for all these years since our inception. We didn't do much other than write about things. And a podcast, in my mind, was a great way to reach audiences that may not pick up a magazine, or they may not pick up or read an article online. It would be able to reach people that we've never connected to before. And in addition to that, you've managed to produce 300 episodes, and look at all the people you've been able to give a voice to who would otherwise not have been heard. It's been a great way to spread knowledge and information and actually provide a mechanism for making the spread of that information entertaining. It can be kind of dry sometimes, but podcasts are wonderfully entertaining and keeps people engaged. I mean, you keep track of the stats. Most people who tune into the podcasts, the Lighthouse Society podcast, they stay for the whole thing.
Well, something like about 3/4 of the listeners listen to at least 3/4 of the episode that they're listening to, which is actually a pretty good percentage.
Yeah, very good percentage. So people stick with it. It does help us with connecting with our existing members for sure. I mean, people love it who are members of the society, but also maybe even more importantly, it helps us connect with people who are outside of our membership to hopefully teach them about us and get them to get involved.
When I launched Lighthearted in June 2019, it seemed to make sense to me to put out an episode every week, and some weeks in the early days I even produced 2 or 3 episodes. As time has gone by, it's gotten harder to keep up the pace. I also manage the Society's digital archives and research catalog, and I'm in the process of uploading my own collection into the archives, Lighthouse research materials I've gathered over the past 40 years. I also produce and host occasional live virtual events, write articles for the Society's journal, The Keeper's Log, and help to lead some of the Society's tours, among other things. So I've decided that from now on, I will produce new episodes of the podcast every 2 weeks instead of every single week. On the off weeks when I can, I will post re-edited and shortened versions of some of the older episodes under the title Lighthearted Light. That's L-I-T-E. In a way, I'm kind of sad to end the schedule of a new episode every week, but I think the change is better for me and better for the podcast. We need lighthouses more than ever as symbols of hope and resilience. We also need connections to each other more than ever. One of the main things I've tried to accomplish with the podcast is to foster a sense of community within the world of lighthouse preservation and lighthouse fans. The author Tom Baker once wrote, quote, "Friends are like lighthouses with the sources of light coming from their hearts," unquote. That's something I've felt since I got involved with lighthouses, and I felt it even more strongly with this podcast. I feel like everyone who has been on the podcast as an interviewee or as a co-host is a friend. I would also extend that to our listeners as well. With that, whether you are a regular listener or listening to this podcast for the first time, thank you so much for listening, and keep a good light.
I'm gonna let it shine. This little light.